Hello and welcome to Art Break. I'm Claire Lyons, Curator of Antiquities at the Getty Villa, which houses the museum's collection of Greek, Etruscan, and Roman art. With respect for the deep history of this region, I'm joining you from Los Angeles on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tonga peoples. Art Break approaches the Getty's collection as a springboard for fresh and, we hope, provocative viewpoints about ancient art and cultures. For today's conversation on seeing Blackness, it's a genuine pleasure to welcome my colleague, Professor Sarah Daribo.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you everyone for attending. As mentioned, my name is Sarah Daribo. I'm an assistant professor of classics at Stanford University, and I'm working on my own research that relates to the topic we'll talk about today. I'm zooming in from Palo Alto, which is the territory of the Muwekma Ohlone people, and I do respect the fact that I am on land that I am not from. In terms of my research, as I mentioned a second ago, my forthcoming book to be published next year is entitled Tentatively Untangling Blackness in Greek Antiquity. And in this book, I examine both literary and artistic representations of Black people, a term we'll talk about more today, in the ancient world in ancient Greece from about the 5th century BCE to the 4th century CE.
Great, well, that makes you the ideal person to talk to about an ongoing curatorial project at the Villa. We've been researching objects in our collection that depict Black Africans, and we're trying to give a more inclusive and balanced account of what was indeed a tangled, to use your word, a tangled multicultural Mediterranean world. One of the more challenging objects that I've been working on is this piece on the screen, which is an Etruscan statuette of a seated Black African youth. For a long time, this statuette was described as a sad child in poor physical condition. And so it attracted a definition. It was given an identity as an African slave boy sleepily awaiting his master. But that's not at all what we're seeing here. In fact, he's a youth in the prime of adolescence. He's not sickly. And he's sitting in the typical rest or slumber pose, one knee upright and head cradled in the hand. These figures are found throughout the Mediterranean and over many centuries. So they strike me as a particularly good case for thinking about how a popular image morphs into a stereotype. We always want to start with a map. So on the next slide, the map focuses on Greece and Italy, where some of the images that we want to consider today were made and used. The Etruscans were a distinct culture centered in what is now the area between Rome and Florence, but extending a good distance to the north and as far down as Naples. They had very close ties with Greeks on the mainland, particularly in terms of trade and artistic exchanges. Now, obviously, different cultures understood images and objects in different ways. I'm really interested in trying to see them, not just through the eyes of the artisans who made them, but also from the vantage of those who owned them and those who handled them. So on this map, Sarah, where and how do you situate Black people?
It's an important question, Claire, and I think over the weeks we've had such a rich time walking through where we would place them. So if we look at a text like Herodotus's Histories, written in the 5th century BCE, Herodotus does not pinpoint Black people being from one place, and this amorphousness filters into the art world as well. So according to Herodotus, people whose skin is Black, who have Black skin, can be from Egypt, which is a bit off the southern limits of this map. Going even further south, Ethiopia is another region that he describes Black people being from. And the etymology of Ethiopia is one I always like to parse out. Itho, I blaze, op space, so the people with blazed faces, presumably from the sun. I tend to stay away from the language of sunburnt because that gets us more into modern connotations of skin color and the negative ways in which being burnt from the sun were not necessarily mapped in antiquity. India is another region. This would be off to the easternmost parts off of this map. and Colchis as well, thinking about the Black Sea and that region. So it's very difficult to find just one place to pinpoint them, which is very different from the ways in which we think about Blackness in the 21st century. So keeping the context in mind is really useful. And these challenges in terms of mapping Black people, Ethiopians, Egyptians, Indians, Colchians, also occurs when we think about how to describe the objects when we see them in situ. On the next slide, we have a close-up of the statuette you mentioned, and even describing what this object looks like can be a really vexed project. There's a great article that was on the Getty blog on Iris that Paula Gaither, Kenneth LePatin, Eliza McAtee, and David Saunders wrote, where they're really thinking through how we can describe these sorts of terms. And I've written an article about it on the Iris as well, but what do we see when we look at it? And I wish we were in person so we could pose this question to our audience. But in the absence of having them physically here, I encourage everyone at home to think about what strikes you first. Is it the curly hair? Is it the broad nose? It's kind of broken off, but we can see a bit of the shape. Is it the full lips? Is it the color? Is it the greenness? And if we think about color, can we ascribe the term Black to this object when it's not clear what part of it is Black, the adjective Black, like the color of my hair, and it's not clear what parts of it are Black in terms of my skin color being categorized and identifying as Black in the 21st century. So there's so much interference from the 21st century as we try to categorize this type of object. I'll pause there, and I'd like to turn back to you, Claire, to ask you more about this imagery. How widespread was it to have these statuettes on particular objects in the ancient Greco-Roman world? And this will take us to the next slide.
Well, the seated youth motif is actually quite common, and it's a type that seems to descend from sitting figures in Egyptian art. But around the turn of the 6th to the 5th centuries, images of Blacks really start to proliferate on bronze and terracotta figurines, on jewelry, and on painted vases. And I suppose this reflects increasing contacts between the Greek mainland and Egypt and the area of Nubia at that time. Early Greek art, as you started to point out, Black Africans typically have quite stylized features as on this bronze relief of a sleeping youth, which decorated the handle of a pitcher. Our statuette has more idealized features, and in fact, it was also a decorative attachment. In fact, it serves as a finial on the top of a candelabrum, and we'll see that in the next slide. This painting from a tomb near Orvieto depicts the gods of the underworld. There were Hades and Persephone, in Etruscan Ita and Persephone. Their banquet table is furnished with an incense burner, and two tall candelabra hold burning candles. And both of those kinds of specialty metalwork were made in Etruscan bronze workshops and exported around the Mediterranean. The painting is a small part of what was really a very large kitchen scene of cooking and preparing the meal. And as you look at it, you might assume that the men near the table are servants or slaves, but there are inscriptions over the heads of various workers, and they designate them as members of both the servile and the aristocratic classes. So we really need to be cautious in jumping to conclusions about servitude simply on the basis of appearance or occupations. In this scene, the elites are the family members who dine with the gods, and their social status is advertised by the array of wine drinking vessels on the table. That's their good silver, so to speak. We know from tomb finds that vase sets were, absolutely essential for drinking and feasting in life as well as death. And Sarah, you've been working on some of this material, and in fact, some quite remarkable images like the one in the next slide.
Definitely. I've played detective a bit, hunting down these Janophorum cantharoi, these two-headed cups, traveling to different countries before the pandemic. So I really enjoy having the opportunity to give them their time in the limelight. The cup that we're looking at here is an Attic red figure drinking cup, and this would have been no bigger than 8 inches, no bigger than maybe, if depending on the size of your palm, from the beginning of your hand to the tips. So it would have been a relatively small drinking cup used in a symposium in Athens in the 5th century BCE. I'll pause when I use the word symposium. Claire, you and I have spoken about this in previous conversations, that this is not a kind of stuffy formal event, a symposium the way we think of it, where people maybe drone on and on depending on the type of symposium you're at, and you sit in chairs in a very organized fashion. This would have been a lively, convivial drinking party. There would have been music and little pockets of romantic action going on, games, oratory. It would have been a very jocular atmosphere. So it's important that when we look at this cup, we remember the context in which it would have been used. It would have been filled with wine, which also adds to the conviviality of the scene. People are getting drunk, men have gathered together, and now they're no longer completely sober. And so their actions become a bit more boisterous. I push back a lot when I look at this cup and read about it. I push back against the interpretation that the face on the right side of the cup, that is the black face, is somehow a negative depiction or a depiction of a enslaved person, and that the face on the left, that is the brown face, is somehow an image of beauty or an image of a Greek woman who is a wine pourer and is someone who perhaps has more in common with the people who are drinking from the cup. Instead, I view it as a performative piece. I've mentioned the symposium was an experience where people came and had a lot of fun and were able to put on a different personality than they have maybe at the Agora, maybe when they're out doing business. And I think about this cup in the same way. There are two different faces, two different masks that are being brought into the party, depending on the type of cupware the organizer of the symposium has, and no one is negative and one is positive. Instead, it's important to see both of them as working in tandem to give the drinkers a different type of face to put on while they're playing. The final word that I'll say about this cup is that there's an inscription on the neck of the cup. You can make out a few of the letters if you read Greek on the image on the right. You can see a kappa, an alpha, and a lambda. Kalos hos pais is the text in Greek, which translates to "this child is beautiful." So the connotations of beauty and different colors, at least different colors of clay on this object, is something for us to pause on too, and to think about the ways in which what beauty meant in Greek antiquity may not map onto how we view it today. But as I've mentioned, these were cups used in the symposia and very fun, lively parties. These parties were not happening with the same frequency that maybe someone wakes up every morning and goes to work. So I'd like us to think now more about the daily life and turn to you, Claire, to give us a little more insight about the way life would have been, maybe more of the drudgeries that would have happened for people living in this time period, as we see on the next slide.
Well, it's not exactly drudgery, but you're right. This, these images are, I like the way you've read them in different ways, because in fact, they're very flexible. Around the same time that the double head cups were being made, Athenian painters started favoring themes that concern aspects of daily life. And that's a very fraught term, daily life. It implies reality. I really want to emphasize, right at the outset, that these scenes were never meant to be snapshots. They reflect artists and viewers' preconceptions. They illustrate what might be familiar or possible or right, but definitely don't think of them in terms of snapshots. Yet still, we look to them for a great deal of information about certain aspects of social life. Here, the seated dozing youth figure is, I've marked it there on the right-hand side. They seem to assume the role of an akoluthos. That's a Greek term that literally means a follower, an attendant who carries the possessions and who caters to the needs of well-born male citizens. That is, those who enjoyed all the prerogatives of democracy. On some vases, the seated attendant waits patiently off to the side of the drinking party, or they can be sitting on the edge of a gymnasium scene, holding an oil flask that athletes would have used for grooming. Here on this hydria, we see a school scene of music lessons, and the boy attendant is sleeping on the ground. His nudity, his posture, his small size are visual cues of his subordinate status. But if you look really broadly across Greek visual culture, Black African attendants are extremely rare in early art. And in fact, hardly any are shown in bondage. And this shouldn't really surprise us because the great majority of slaves in Greek society were, in fact, other Greeks. So here in this scene, though, I'm really struck by it because these are privileged students and they even brought their fancy pets to school. And it reminds me of a profile in Theophrastus, who mocks the pretentious elites that flaunted an Ethiopian, so-called Ethiopian attendant. How do you read Theophrastus on this kind of person?
And I laugh, Claire, I laugh silently to respect not speaking over you, but it is funny to think about the ways in which people become maybe character types that reflect more about the person speaking rather than the actual group. So as you mentioned, Theophrastus, a 4th century Greek writer, in his characters, in his character sketch of different people, talks about a man of petty ambition in chapter 21, Mikro Philotimos. And this man in chapter 4 is described as having an Ethiopian attendant, but this is in addition later in the character sketch to having very exotic animals. He also decides that he's going to build a tomb for his dog, and he's very ostentatious with his wealth in a way that sort of feels very nouveau riche if we think about it today. He really wants to fit into the Hall Oligoi group. He wants to be one of the few who have power, but we really learn a lot about him, and he treats this Ethiopian as a rare commodity that fits into his menagerie of animals and of his kind of flashy livelihood. The trope of Ethiopians as a stand-in for a luxury or commodity group appears on the next slide as well. And on this slide, we see a small, no bigger than 7 inches oil flask in this container. This alabastron would have been used for perfumed oil. So you can imagine that women would get their incense or they would get their particular fragrances from the region south of Egypt, from Ethiopia, from Aksum, and from Red Sea trade as well. And they would put it into this flask with oil and use it to make themselves smell good in similar ways that we do today. The image on this alabastron is particularly exciting to think through because we have someone with Black skin, if we treat Black as a very flat objective color marker, and the clothes are striking. There's a bit of a peplum top with stripes going horizontally and vertically across the shirt. Seems like it might be sleeveless. There's a mantle being flung over the arms, and we can't see the side images, but the figure is holding a bow and quiver. And the pants have both polka dots and stripes, perhaps likening the figure to a Persian. It's unclear, but I really like Jennifer Neal's reading of this as an Amazonian warrior, because then we start thinking about the ways in which the connotation between Black people and warriors and powerful soldiers is a very popular trope in ancient Greek art and literature. Frank Snowden Jr. writes a lot about this as well. The image of the Black in Western art, edited by David Beinman and Henry Louis Gates Jr., also looks at this trope of Ethiopians, or Nubians as they're sometimes called, as archers, as people who are rounded up to fight on behalf of Persia, for example, in the Greco-Persian Wars, or who fight for their own self-interests. I'd like us to think perhaps more about the Etruscan side, since I've been very Greek heavy. So I'm wondering, Claire, are there ways in which we see this Black warrior trope or Black African warrior trope in Etruscan art?
Well,
and
yes,
you can go to the next slide for this one.
Yeah, this is a good example. It's one of the most visible manifestations of a prominent African head that decorated Etruscan religious buildings. There were several temples around the main Etruscan site of Cervetri that had these large tiles placed along the edge of the roof. And quite similar to the double head vase that you showed, they formed a row of alternating heads of Blacks, female divinities, and satyrs. Some of those head vases also have alternating Black and satyr heads. So they would have surrounded a sacred space, and they probably would have worked as a kind of protective icon. Figures like our little statuette also occupied ritual spaces. They decorated funerary objects related to fire and light, like the candle holders I showed, and also torches. Two of them appear on bronze containers from tombs at the site of Pampeluna. And one of them actually contained little terracotta vials of perfumes, which were likely imported from either the sub-Saharan area or the Arabian Peninsula. And in that very same tomb group, which scholars think may have belonged to a priestess, there are several vases that illustrate myths of Aphrodite, of the handsome Adonis, and the rejuvenating power of perfumed oils. So this is an extended account of one particular context that really matters. In Etruria, ritual settings outnumber by far the images of Black Africans that you might see in domestic servitude. So, and from what you said before about the alabastron, it really strikes me, Sarah, that beauty is a consistent theme. It's a thread that's winding through Etruscan and Greek iconography in some very interesting ways. And in fact, in the next slide, it's absolutely explicit.
Completely. This is, I want to say my favorite cup, but it feels like if you have a lot of children, you don't choose one that you like the best. This is a cup of the moment for now. And I really like this one because it pushes me to think in different ways about even the language of a Black face. So I showed these two faces next to each other to even have all of us in the audience to think about, are these representations of a Black person and a white person? Is there any use? Can that register of language even apply here? In my own work and in my forthcoming book, I describe these both as brown faces and really encourage myself and my readers to think through what happens when we suspend our contemporary beliefs for a moment and we don't assume that the figure on the right, although he has a broad nose and full lips, we don't assume that somehow he's in the category of Black, which means that he cannot be put in the same category as the face on the right, as the face on the left. And in the same regard, then, if we call them both brown, they end up being classified in the same category. If we think about the ways in which museums categorize objects, maybe this really shakes up how museums even think about where does Blackness fit in their topography. Yeah. I really like the inscription of these cups. I've written out the translation in English on this slide. The face on the left reads on the rim, "I am very beautiful, Aranasa," and the face on the right reads, "Timolus is as handsome as his face." So this is returning to the idea of Blackness, rather the idea of particular geographical regions and beauty that we've discussed earlier. But I also like this inscription because it reminds us that these two faces are working in conversation with each other, or at least they're physically connected, and wanting to parse one as beautiful and the other as ugly, or one as divine and respectful and the other as humorous, reflects our own perhaps uncritically examined biases rather than what's going on in antiquity. A final note that I'll say is the etymology of their names really cracks me up. Aranasa's name breaks down in terms of the Greek to lovely duck, and Timolos is honorable mongoose. So even if we're going to treat them both as being humorous and maybe somehow deprecatory descriptions, it applies to both faces, and not only the one that through the transatlantic slave trade and history has been given a name that doesn't quite fit it. But I will move us forward. We're running close to time and we want to leave time for questions. I'm curious, Claire, if we think about these tropes moving forward in history, how in later centuries do we interact with images of Blackness or images of people with full lips and broad noses and curly hair?
Well, it's not going to be for a few more centuries, but at a certain point in Hellenistic and Roman art, we start to find small bronze sculptures of the seated Black youth type regularly shown as captives. Some of them are even shackled. The connection between African subjects, light and flame intensifies as on, I meant to change the slide. Yeah, here on the object on the left, this association with light and flame, this is an incense shovel with the head of a Black African on the handle. There are also a series of unguent flasks that assume the shape of a Roman laternarius. That's the Latin term for the slave who lit the candles and held a lantern. Everyday objects reproduce negative stereotypes, and some of them really have quite dramatically, unpleasantly caricatured racial features. To our eyes, they're quite uncomfortable. But Hellenistic and Roman artists didn't hesitate to exploit the harsh realities of the human condition. They really seem to delight in the poor, the elderly, and the disabled. Maybe even more insidious, though, are the images of desirable young men on torches, on jugs, and on drinking cups, because in effect, they act as human tools. As one scholar put it, they embody good luck, good looks, hard work, and obedience, qualities that frame enslaved people as something pleasing and natural. So this raises, I think, a hard question, and I lined this one up for you, Sarah. If our finial of a young African was not necessarily in an attendant, what did it signify? Did the elite owners connect it a sympathetic figure glowing in the candlelight with ritual imagery that was all around them? Was it simply a very elegant furnishing for their dining rooms? Or did such Etruscan objects already anticipate the Roman habit of stereotyping Ethiopians by turning them into the instruments of the labor they were obliged to perform? What do you think?
It's a fair question. And again, it comes back to this idea of where you stand, your own position can affect the ways in which you view the object. So even as we organized this talk and we began with the statuette that was on our first slide, I saw a philosopher, and whenever I interact with images of people like the figure on the right here that is kind of crouched over, I think of someone who is so invested in the intellectual mind that they don't really have time to do things like stand up straight or even be, I guess, even be awake. They're so in their minds. But this is also informed by the ways in which I'm interested in Timbuktu and the Malian Empire and Nubia, and the ways in which ancient African history is so much richer than simply only thinking about European investments or European colonization. So I do think that the ways in which we engage with the objects is very much informed by our own educational backgrounds or our own personal histories as well. I will say as a wrap up for what I really hope that our audience will take away from this talk is that the context is really important. When we view things like the incense shovel or the perfume vessel, it's important to remember that the worlds in which these objects were created are not our world. But conversely, we also exist in a world where we cannot unsee race. We cannot unsee the ways in which Blackness has been permutated to satisfy particular colonial enterprises. But with an acknowledgement of both, I think we can really get a perspective of these objects that is not commonly seen, where we see it in context, but we also recognize that our own eyes are a work in progress in terms of we must constantly interrogate ourselves at every step of the way so that we ensure that at least for the next generation, we're giving them information that then they can take and shape in their own way, but that they know that we are not the final word.
Well, for us, we're getting to the point where we might have to have our final word, but I want to give our audience their words. This topic is just really so fascinating. It's leading in a lot of intriguing directions. But in the next slide, just to have it on as background for our conversation, I put in a sample of objects from the Villa collection that the curators have been researching. And this is a collective project, not only in our own museum, but in museums across the country. So just as things to think with, starting at the top, a terracotta head, maybe of an African from the South Italian city of Taranto, an Egyptian seal of the 6th century, a gem, a carved gem, which is not ancient, which in fact is an 18th or 19th century gem of with a portrait bust of an African, another head vase in our own collection, as well as a theater image from a 4th century South Italian vase in which a figure is wearing costumes and an African mask. And finally, yet again, one of the many, many lamps with the heads of an African and the flame that would have come out as a sort of out of the mouth. So keep those in mind. And while you do, I am going to have a look at the Q&A and see how many questions we can get to.
I can take the first one. I see that there's a question from Tanya Denhere, and this will take us back to slide number 7, so to the Janiform cup from the Boston MFA. And Tanya asks, I'm curious, is that an adornment earring on the black side of the two-headed cup? And as we get back to this image of this Janiform cup, it's curious the ways in which gender plays a role or doesn't play a role, at least in the ways we view these images. So Tanya, thank you for your question, because as we see in the image on the right, the face on the right does have an earring, but gender is not always afforded equal opportunity on these sorts of cups. And a lot of descriptions that I found in museums and even the labels that I see in museums, the face on the left is described as a woman, so unmarked where she's from, or a Greek woman. And the face on the right is described as an African, a Negroid, a Black person, but it's rare that the gender appears there. And I mean, Negro is a term that we can unpack too, and I use this more to recognize the ways in which it was used in anthropology, both by Black and white people in the 50s and 60s, and not in any derogatory sense. But it's curious that the face on the right is not afforded having a gender. And this is something that shows up on the Beasley Archive, which is a comprehensive pottery database as well. So that earring does perhaps imply gender. It may also imply that this was a person who was a warrior. Earrings were sometimes worn by particular communities to signify that they were very heroic in battle. And the exposed teeth as well is something that people have picked up on. The face on the right has exposed teeth, which may indicate humor. It's unclear exactly what it signifies, and the face on the left doesn't. But it is important, as much as I'm saying, to think about both of these cups in tandem, to recognize that there are visual differences that may signify particular elements of the mask. If you buy my language of performance, there are particular elements of the mask that are different as well.
Well, let's stick with that slide, because the next question, Allison Perchuk has sent in one, and it's closely rated. So let me read it out to you. The double-headed Canthros is roughly contemporary with the invention of red figure painting and with the bilingual vases that helped ease that transition from black figure to red figure. Could you speak about the potential links between the transition and this type of objects, and about the very different senses of black involved, not only technical, but also the representation of the type? And maybe if you can just give me one word on this, Sarah, because this really interests me, not only on these vases, but also on the architectural decoration that we saw, so that there is a sense that, yes, we are looking at two different kinds of people, but I also wonder if it's a factor of the artist playing with the potential of the ceramic art and being able to use the black glaze to its greatest effect, and then create an opposition, not only between the lighter skinned and the darker skinned, the male and the female. And, you know, it's really quite sophisticated. There have been some scholars that, you know, wonder if we are looking at a representation of an individual from the furthest extent to the south of the known world, and then someone from the far north. So that's a kind of encompassing view. And then on the temples, of course, the satyr heads would be the world beyond. So I think there are conceptual as well as technical features of these vases that really are so interesting. And I want to thank Allison for that question, but can you add to it?
I can, because as you're speaking, Claire, my mind is jumping to the Hippocratic treatise, Airs, Waters, and Places. You're taking us into the world of environment. At least you're taking me there. May the audience come with us. But the ways in which there's this almost desire, contemporary desire to have a black-white binary very much affects the ways we view this cup. There is no whiteness on the cup, only the sclera of the eyes and the teeth of the face on the left. But museum curators, art historians, classicists sometimes see the face on the left as white. And returning to the text I mentioned, Airs, Waters, and Places, is Hippocratic treatise. And some of you may know Hippocrates from the Hippocratic Oath that medical doctors take before they begin their service. But in this treatise, this text describes the people from Scythia being white and presumably, rather, they're white or they're red, presumably because of the coldness, and then Ethiopians are black because of their proximity to the sun. So even if we try to map on this idea of blackness and whiteness onto the ancient world, it doesn't really fit to put the Greeks in the category of white, because white is a term that very much was manipulated by European slave owners during the transatlantic slave trade. And if we take white with a lowercase w as an objective color marker, it doesn't really apply to either face on this cup. I'd
Good.
like to turn to a question by Susan Jarrett. Apologies if I mispronounced your name, who asks if we can comment on the trope of the holy Ethiopian, the figure of Memnon, or blackness in Heliodorus' novel Ethiopian Story. Thank you for your question, Susan. There is so much more that we didn't include in this presentation. The idea of the Ethiopian as being perhaps holy or wise, being a gymnosophist, the person you go to for wisdom, does show up in Heliodorus' novel. A quick word about this novel: it was written in the 4th century CE, and it follows the trials and tribulations of a young woman whose skin color is white. And here, white, lowercase w, white, the color of my sclera of my eyes or my teeth on a good day. This whiteness makes it difficult for her parents to accept her as their daughter because they are the king and queen of Ethiopia and their skin color is black. So she grows up believing herself to be Greek and eventually makes it home to Ethiopia, to the kingdom of her parents, and she's accepted as the princess of Ethiopia. But skin color plays a very big role. In this text, black skin color constitutes cultural privilege. So the blackness is something that Chariclea, had she had it, would have been able to stay home. But because she doesn't, she travels and has to eventually find out that she is not Greek and she's Ethiopian. So this idea of royal Ethiopian shows up in terms of holy Ethiopians in the 8th century or 7th century BCE, whenever you believe the Homeric epics to have been recited and then penned. The Ethiopians are semi-divine people that Zeus and Poseidon and Iris, Greek gods, go to visit. So the land of Ethiopia, the land of the people with blazed face, is a place where gods visit and a place where people who don't really interact with mortals too much exist. And later on, we get more mundane, grounded representations of them.
Okay, there are a couple of questions that relate to this mosaic of images that I actually have on the slide. And in particular, I'll just read out one from Jennifer Olivares. Is the Getty interpreting the finial and other objects to address previous assumptions and provide new research perspectives to audiences? And if so, are you doing this at the level of the gallery panel for a group of objects or at the individual label level? Well, yeah, we love to think about labels and panels, but yes, this is an effort that's looking across the board at many different kinds of objects so that we don't just automatically repeat assumptions like the one I started this discussion with, that's the boy must be in poor physical condition and therefore ergo he is a slave. So this is addressing quite a few objects. We are in the process of revising labels, but as anyone who's been to any museum knows, the space on a label is not enough to express all the ideas and insights that we have. So in many cases, we need to find ways to get people back to our collection pages where we have a much richer and fuller discussion. I also mentioned that this was a collective project. It is among our department for sure. And it's even broader than this. We want to look at images of violence against women, all those myths that seem so delightful. Some of them are pretty terrible, and other kinds of images, and check ourselves a bit. But we've also been in contact with and have meetings with curators around the country who are looking at their own collections. So it's really exciting. We're kind of in the beginning, but stay posted. I think we're going to have a lot of information for you.
I'd like to take the next question, and Claire, I'll pose it to you as well. I think that you'll have a lot to say because you deal with more objects than I do. Kristen Windmuller Luna asks, can we speak more about materiality with regards to antique representations of Blackness? Were different materials used for Black figures, as in the later cameo and the final slide, or was there material parity across antique representations? This is a great question, particularly because it reminds us that what we're seeing today is not somehow representative of everything in the ancient world. And even with Athenian pottery, perhaps, I mean, even saying 10% of all pottery that was made survives is a hugely generous estimate. We get so little, I think 1% may be closer to the reality. We get so little of how much pottery actually existed that we sometimes can put too much attention or give too much weight to something when this may have been a one-off or this may not have been as common. But in terms of my own work, Kristen, I tend to focus on Athenian pottery from the 5th century. So these are clay objects. And I focus a lot on these cups. They're about 74 Janiform cups, and of those, about 14 have a black face on one side, but it is a very small corpus. So I would ask you, Claire, in terms of having a wider scope of both the Getty collections and other museums' collections, what other materials have you seen being used to depict Blackness?
Well, I mean, there's some wonderful, we didn't get a chance to see them, but also in the Etruscan ceramic tradition, there are some fantastic vases also in the shape of African heads. And they're later, they're 4th century, but they are, particularly good looking, and they take advantage of this lustrous black glaze that was very, very common in Italy in this period. We also find some other carved gems that are carved from onyx, so just jet black, very, very striking. But one of the challenges of working with this material is that, in fact, for the most part, when we deal with bronze, bronze can be dark naturally, it can be almost black, but it eventually oxidizes to green. Terracotta, fires to orange. So unless there are other markers, really distinctive physiognomy or other characteristics in which Greek and Etruscan artists wanted to, especially Greek, and wanted to indicate, foreign others, we would have to look very closely at clothing, weapons, and other clues for trying to understand exactly who we're seeing. So on the one hand, we want to I caution against overemphasizing or jumping to a conclusion that someone we see is a slave based on some superficial characteristics. But on the other hand, we don't want to neglect that very essential aspect of ancient society. We don't want to whitewash it. And if we don't see it, assume it's not there. The effect, of this institution was really deep. And what interests me is how maybe innocuous visual imagery just naturalizes it. It just, it makes it attractive and useful. And these motifs are very mobile. They're very flexible. So they serve a lot of different purposes. We are getting very close to our time limit. Sarah, we have maybe time for one more?
Sure, I see one from an anonymous attendee that I'd like to tackle. And this question reads, do you see the roots of our tendency to identify Blackness in negative ways in our own history in the US, or is it much bigger than that? And I'd like to end here because I do think that we all have different ways in which we can rehabilitate, decolonize, for those who want to use that language, the art historical world. And for me, something I find very simple that I hope all of you can think through is even the ways in which we use language. So calling a community enslaved versus slaves, or thinking about the etymology of the word denigrate and it having Negra in it, and the ways in which if we use that word, we're almost co-opting this idea of Blackness as being bad. So I do think that thinking through our own vocabulary choices, or pushing ourselves not to imagine Blackness and whiteness as polar opposites that apply through time immemorial, can be really useful ways, albeit small ways, but useful ways for us to start unlearning maybe some of the more damaging stereotypes that, if they remain unchallenged, will become fossilized for the next generation. What do you think, Claire? Do you think that there are ways in which we can rehabilitate these archives for wider audiences?
Well, yes, and that's exactly what we really want to do. But we've shown such a small sample here. It's really a wonderful collection and very, very rich selection of images that we have to work with. And I think what's needed next is to really look much harder and look and interrogate the the archaeological record, because there's a lot more out them. Even in my short excursion into the Etruscan sphere, there's a lot of material to work with. And as important as the book that you mentioned by Professor Frank Snowden is, it was seminal. It started so much, but it's a few decades old, and I think it's time to revisit it and add to what he has done. So with that, I know that we're going to be continuing to talk. We are all tremendously grateful for your insights on untangling Blackness, and we're really looking forward to reading your soon to be published book. Please bring your students to the Getty Villa. We could have a great seminar on this material. I also want to thank all the viewers for joining us and bringing your good questions. We're saving them. If it's at all possible, I'm going to try to get back to you. Please visit getty.edu for information about our next program. And until the next time, thanks and bye for now.